So I think we'll get started. Who could. So I'm Matt Jordan. I'm the head of the Department of Film Production and Media Studies in the Belisario College of Communications here at Penn State, and I'm extremely excited about tonight's speaker, Corey Doctorow. So first off, I'd like to thank the Belisario College of Communications, the College of Information Science and Technology, the Pioneers Chair in Telecommunications, and the Courtney Institute for Democracy and the Department of English, all of whom helped to kind of create a collective to sponsor this talk. A special shout out to Shannon Brace, who worked so hard to lock down the details, and to Steve Samsel, who helped get the word out. There's something excremental at the heart of contemporary culture. We can smell it, taste it, feel its shifting automated squeeze. And tonight's speaker, Corey Doctorow, helps us put it to words. As a crackdown critic, activist, and novelist who has collaborated with technology and information science researchers at MIT, Open University, UNC, and Cornell, Doctorow has the perfect skill set for making sense of our digitalized life world and its structure of feeling. His almost quotidian columns at pluralistic.net unpack ongoing events, monops new features of platform economics or tech industry trends. Today's link to talk he just gave at the University of Toronto, covering things like how a labor app figures out how much debt nurses have and then pays them less based on that debt. I'll probably describe that tonight. He's also expanded these shorter essays into nonfiction books like Joke Point Capitalism or The Internet Con, which pull back the curtain on the digital platforms and apps that we use to organize our lives. And if you've read them, you'll know why he doesn't sell his books on Audible, and also why, since we're recording tonight's lecture to distribute via YouTube, why I'm not going to utter his neologism named last year's Word of the Year in the first couple minutes of this talk. As an activist with the UK Open Rights Group and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, he has worked to help people get wise to the bunco-steering tech oligarchs and how their self-serving platforms have restricted our capacity to communicate and experience various forms of freedom, producing plans and policies to help people take collective action to gain some of it back. In his fiction writing, he takes these techno-social forces, media trends, and economic logics that he describes as nonfiction work and uses them as scaffolding to build worlds occupied by characters who must struggle against them. Sometimes, as in the case of the four-novella collection Radicalized, or in the novel The Lost Cause, he sets the stories in the near dystopic future. Sometimes, as in his latest novel, Picks and Shovels, which his current tour is supporting, the story is set in the recent past, when the Silicon Valley stink bullying our life world was just starting to get musky. All told, and I'm told there are a couple more books on the way, he has published over 24 books. Some of them will be waiting right in the back, right out front there for you, if you'd like one to take home with you after the talk. All of them are page turners. Ladies and gentlemen, Corey Doctorow.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored by that great introduction. And as you heard, tonight's talk is not only about tech platforms, but I'm going to start by telling you about nurses. Specifically, I'm going to tell you about a report that was published last month by the Groundwork Collective about how nurses in the US are increasingly hired by hospitals through gig apps, these Uber for nurses apps. And that means that the nurses who work in your hospital typically don't know from one day to the next whether they're going to get a shift. And even more importantly, they don't know how much that shift is going to pay them by the hour. Now, that last part involves something very high tech that really ties into the theme of my remarks tonight. The nursing apps, which are a cartel of just three giant companies, one's called ShiftKey, one's called ShiftMed, one's called CareRec. They play all kinds of games with how they price nurses' labor. Before ShiftKey offers a nurse a shift, it purchases that worker's credit history from a sleazy data worker. Specifically, it is paying to find out how much credit card debt that nurse is carrying and whether it's delinquent. And if it is, the more desperate that nurse is, the lower the wage that that nurse is offered, because the more desperate you are, the less money you'll accept to show up and do the grunt work of caring for the sick, the elderly, and the dying. Now, there are lots of things going on in this little example, and of course, they're all terrible. But the reason I bring it up is because they're also emblematic of this word I came up with, enshittification. It's a word I coined to describe the decay of online platforms. Now, when I started writing about enshittification, I focused on the outward symptoms, what you can observe as a user of technology as we enter the Enshitocene. And I described a three-stage process. At first, you have a platform that's good to its end users, but it's also looking to find a way to lock those end users in. So let's think about Google here. Google, when it started, it minimized ads, it maximized engineering spending on search results. But as they were doing that, they were buying their way to dominance. They bribed every service or device that had a search box on it into making Google the search engine on the other end of the search box. So no matter what browser you were using, no matter what mobile OS you were using, no matter what carrier you were signed on to, every search would be a Google search by default. Now this got so batshit that by the early part of this decade, Google was spending enough to buy a whole ass Twitter every 18 months or so, just to be sure you never tried a search engine that wasn't theirs. Now that is stage one, be good to end users, log the end users in. Once that's done, you can move on to stage two, where the platform can start to abuse end users, safe in the knowledge that they're logged in and they're not going to go anywhere unless you really turn the screws too fast. And when you do that, you tempt in business customers who will show up to try and sell things or make money off of the end users. So for Google, the business customers were advertisers and publishers. And today you can see that an ever larger fraction of Google search results is given over to ads. And those ads are marked with ever subtler, ever fainter indicia that tells you that it's an ad and not a Google search result. And Google uses that commercial surveillance data to also target ads on publishers' websites all around the internet. So that's stage two. Things get worse for end users, but they get better for business customers who come in and get locked into the platform as well, because they are dependent on those customers. You know, once a business is getting like 10% of its revenue through Google, leaving Google becomes an existential risk. Economists call that monopsony power. We talk a lot about monopoly power. We have a powerful seller, but a monopsonist is a powerful buyer. And because businesses can't afford to have 10% of their revenue disappear overnight, once you're getting 10% of your revenue from Google, it might as well be 100% in terms of how much control Google can exert over your business. So now you have Google acting as a monopolist towards its users and a monopsonist towards its business customers. That's stage two. And here comes stage three, where Google claws back all of the value, leaving behind a bare homeopathic residue calculated to keep those end users locked in so that the business users will also be locked into those end users. Now in 2019, Google hit a turning point. Search had grown as much as it possibly could. More than 90% of us search on Google. And when we search for anything and everything. Every time some fool question came into your head, you would rush to a keyboard and type it into a Google search box. So how is Google going to grow? There were no more users left to switch to Google, and the users that Google had weren't going to search any more than they already were. What was Google going to do? Well, thanks to memos published in last year's Department of Justice monopolization case against Google, we know what Google did. What they did was they made search worse. They deliberately tuned down the system's accuracy so that you have to search twice or more to get the answer to a question that you used to get on your first search query. That doubles the number of queries, which doubles the number of ads, which increases the revenue, and post that route. Meanwhile, Google entered into a secret, illegal, collusive arrangement with Meta to rig the ad market so that publishers would get paid less, but advertisers would pay more. They called this arrangement Jedi Blue. And that's how we get to the enshittified Google that we all use today, where every query serves back first a blob of AI slop, and over that, 5 paid results tagged with the word ad in 10% gray on white type at 8 points. And below that, the organic search results, which is 10 links from spammy SEO companies that lead to pages with more AI slop. And yet, we are all still using Google because we are locked into Google. And that is enshittification from the outside. A company is first good to its end users, it locks them in. Then it's good to its business customers, while making things worse for its end users, it locks them in. And then it takes all the value for itself and turns into a giant pile of shit. Enshittification, a tragedy in 3 acts. So I started off focused on these outward signs of enshittification, but I think it's important that we now turn to the internal mechanisms that allow enshittification, that make it possible, the technical mechanism of enshittification. I call this twiddling. Digital businesses, you see, have infinite flexibility that's bequeathed to them by the marvelously flexible digital computers that these digital businesses run on top of. And that means that firms can twiddle the knobs on the back end to control the fundamental aspects of their business. So that every time you interact with a firm, everything about the rules of the operation are different. The prices can change, the costs can change, search rankings, algorithms, and recommendations can all be different every time you interact and for every person who interacts with the firm. Which takes me back to the nurses. This scam, where pricing on labor is individualized based on an instantaneous lookup of a nurse's debt load to tighter down the wage that's offered based on how delinquent that nurse's debts are in real time, that is twiddling. It's something you can only do with a computer. The bosses who do this are not more evil than the bosses of yore. Rather, they have better tools. I mean, these aren't even tech bosses, right? They're healthcare bosses who happen to have tech. Digitalization, the weaving of network computers through every firm and every sector, enables the kind of twiddling that allows firms to move value around, from end users to business customers, from business customers to end users, and then all inevitably to themselves. And digitalization is coming to every sector, like nursing, which means that enshittification will come to every sector, including nursing. The legal scholar Vina Duval, she coined a term to describe this twiddling that's done in service to suppressing the wages of gig workers. She calls it algorithmic wage discrimination. And it follows the gig economy. After all, the gig economy is a huge locus of enshittification. It is the rip in reality where the virtual world and the physical world leak over into each other. Gig work, where your shitty boss is a shitty app and you aren't even allowed to call yourself a worker. Uber invented this trick. Drivers for Uber who are picky about the jobs that the app puts in front of them get offered a higher wage on the next job. But if they yield to temptation and they take some of those higher wage gigs, then the wage that they're offered starts to go down again in random intervals, in small increments, designed to be below the threshold for human noticing. So they're not so much boiling the frog here as poaching it. And what happens is the Uber driver's wage goes down and down and down until that driver's gone in debt to buy a car, given up the side hustles that let them be so picky about which jobs they're going to take, and then strands them driving for Uber at a sub-minimum wage that they can't get by on, which is good for Uber, not because they're sadistic, but it means they've lowered their labor rates. Twiddling is a crude trick, but it's done very quickly. After all, any task that is simple but time-consuming is a prime candidate for automation. And this kind of wage theft would be unbearably tedious, labor-intensive, and expensive to perform manually. No 19th century warehouse full of guys in green eye shades slaving over ledgers could do this. You need digitalization to do algorithmic wage discrimination. Twiddling nurses' wages is a perfect example of the role digitalization plays in enshittification. Because this kind of thing isn't just bad for nurses, it's really bad for patients too. I mean, do we really think that paying nurses based on how desperate they are, at a rate calculated to increase that desperation, and thus decrease the wage that they're willing to work for, is going to result in us, the patients, receiving the best care? Like, do you want your catheter inserted by a nurse on food stamps who drove Uber until midnight last night and had to skip breakfast this morning because it was breakfast or rent this month? That is why it is so foolish to say, if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. This statement, if you're not paying for the product, describes a kind of mystical power to advertising-driven services. This power to bypass our critical faculties by surveilling us and data mining the resulting non-consensual dossiers to locate our mental blind spots and weaponize them to get us to buy whatever it is an advertiser is selling. In this formulation, we become complicit in our own exploitation. In this formulation, our choice to use these free services invites our exploitation by surveillance capitalists who have perfected a mind control ray powered by surveillance data and that we're voluntarily handing over by choosing acronym services. The moral of that story is that if only we would go back to paying for things instead of unrealistically demanding everything for free, we could restore a true capitalism, to a functional non-surveillance state, and companies would treat us better because we'd be their customers and not the products. That's why surveillance capitalism advocates are always elevating companies like Apple to a kind of virtuous pillar. Because Apple charges us money rather than attention, supposedly it will then focus on giving us better service rather than exploiting us. And yes, there is a superficially plausible ring to this. And yeah, in 2022, Apple did update the iOS operating system, which runs on iPhones and other mobile devices. They introduced a tick box, and if you ticked it, you could opt out of third-party surveillance, most notably Facebook surveillance. And 96% of Apple customers ticked the opting out of surveillance box. And the other 4%, presumably, were either drunk or Facebook employees who were drunk, which makes sense because if I worked for Facebook, I would be drunk all the time. So on the face of it, it seems like Apple, they're not treating their customers like the product, but simultaneous with this new privacy feature rollout, Apple secretly turned on identical surveillance on iOS platforms of its own users for its own uses because it was starting a rival ad targeting network. And it did not tell the users about this. It did not give them a box they could use to opt out of it. And when newspapers broke the story that they were doing it, Apple lied about it. So it goes without saying that the $1,000 Apple distraction rectangle in your pocket is something that you paid for. The fact that you paid for it does not stop Apple from treating you like the product. Apple treats its business customers, the app vendors, like the product, and screws them out of 30 cents out of every dollar that they bring in with their apps, with mandatory payment processing fees that are 1,000% higher than any normal payment processing system, which is itself extortionate. Apple treats its end users, the people who shell out a grand for a phone, also like they're the product, spying on them to help target ads to them. Apple treats everyone like the product. That's what's going on with these gig app nurses. The nurses are the product, the patients are the product, the hospitals are the product. And in shittification, the product is anyone you can get away with productizing. Fair and dignified treatment is not something you get as a customer loyalty perk in exchange for parting with your money rather than your attention. So how do you get fair and dignified treatment? Well, I'm going to get to that at the end of this talk, but for a minute I want to return to our nurses here. The nurses are the product. They're being twiddled because they've been conscripted into the tech industry via the digitization of their own industry. And it's tempting to say, okay, digitalization is responsible for this. But tech companies, the first digitalized industries, they were not born and shitified. They spent years, they spent decades making pleasing products. If you're old enough to remember the launch of Google, then you'll recall that at the outset, Google was magic. You could ask Jeeves questions for 1,000,000 years. You could load up Alta Vista with 10 trillion Boolean search operators meant to screen out the low-grade results, and you would never arrive at an answer as crisp, as useful, as helpful as the one you get from just a few vaguely descriptive words typed into a Google search box. That's why we switched to Google. That's why we bought iPhones. That's why we joined our friends on Facebook. The services were born digital. They could have been shitified at any time, but they didn't until they did, and then they all did it at once. So if you were a nurse, and every patient that staggered into your emergency room had the same dreadful symptoms, you'd be on the phone to the public health department to report an outbreak of a new virulent infection. Technology's outcomes are not preordained. They are the result of deliberate choices. This is something that you learn when you're a science fiction writer. Good science fiction is not merely about what technology does, but mostly about what new technology does it for and who technology does it to. The social factors of a technology are much more important than their mere technical specifications of some gadget. It's the difference between a system that warns you when you're about to drift out of your lane and a system that tells your insurer that you almost drifted out of your lane so they can tack $10 onto your bill that month. It's the difference between the spell checker that tells you when you made a typo and the bossware that lets your manager use the fact that you made a typo to take $5 off your bonus this quarter. It's the difference between an app that remembers where you parked your car and an app that uses the fact that it knows where your car was parked to include you in a reverse warrant for the identities of everyone who's in the vicinity of an anti-government protest. I don't think that shitification arises from changes in our technology. but rather changes to our policy environment. Changes to the rules of the game that were undertaken in living memory by named parties who were warned at the time that this was the likely outcome of their actions, who did it anyway, who are today very rich and respected, who face no consequences or accountability for their role in ushering in this Enshitocene, who venture out into polite society without ever once wondering whether someone is sizing them up for a pitchfork. In other words, I think we created a crimogenic environment, a perfect breeding pool for the most pathogenic practices in our society that have therefore multiplied, dominating decision-making in our firms and governments, leading to a vast enshitting of everything. And I think there's kind of some good news in there. Because if enshittification is not the result of a new kind of evil person, or the great forces of history bearing down on this moment, turning everything to shit, but rather the result of specific policy choices, then we can reverse those choices. We can make better policy choices. We can emerge from the Enshitocene. We can consign the Enshitternet to the scrap heap of history, a mere transitional state between the old good internet we used to have and the new good internet we might have someday. Now, I'm not going to talk about AI today because, oh my God, is AI boring and overhyped. But I will use a metaphor about AI, about the limited liability company as a kind of artificial life form, an immortal artificial colony organism in which human beings serve as a kind of gut flora, what my colleague Charlie Strauss calls slow AI. And you've got these slow AIs out there, and their guts are just teeming with different kinds of people. And the AI is imperative, right? The paperclip that it wants to maximize and turn the planet into is profits. Now, to maximize profits, there's a simple heuristic. You charge as much as you can. You pay as little to your suppliers and your workers as you can. You spend as little as you can on safety and quality. Every dollar that you don't spend on suppliers, workers, safety, and quality is a dollar you retain for your executives and your shareholders. So there's a very simple model here for a corporation maximizing its profits. It charges infinity dollars, and it spends nothing on workers or suppliers, safety, or product quality. But that corporation obviously isn't going to make any money, for the obvious reasons that none of us would buy anything from it, and no one would work for it if it ran on those terms. So those constraints, right? Who's willing to work for it? Who's willing to buy its products? They act as disciplining forces that tamp down the elements in the AI that have this impulse to charge infinity and pay nothing. In tech, there are actually 4 constraints on the conduct of firms. These are anti-enshittificatory sources of discipline that makes products and services better, pay workers more, and keep executives and shareholders well from growing at the expense of customers, suppliers, and workforces. The first of these constraints, obviously, is markets. All other things being equal, a company that charges more and delivers less will lose customers to firms that are more generous in the value that they allow their workers, their suppliers, and their customers to retain. It's the bedrock of capitalist theory. It's the ideological basis for competition law, for antitrust law. The first antitrust law was 1890's Sherman Act, whose sponsor, Senator John Sherman, the brother of Tecumseh Sherman, stumped for it from the Senate floor, saying, if we will not endure a king as a political power, we should not endure a king over the production, transportation, and sale of the necessaries of life. If we would not submit to an emperor, we should not submit to an autocrat of trade with the power to prevent competition and fix the price of any commodity. Senator Sherman was reflecting a popular outrage of the anti-monopolist movement of that day, when proprietors of large monopolistic firms assumed the role of dictators, with the power to decide who would work and who would starve, what would be sold, and what it would cost. Lacking competitors, these firms became too big to fail, too big to jail, and that made them too big to care. It's like Lily Tomlin used to say on those fake AT&T ads on Saturday Night Live, we don't care, we don't have to, we're the phone company. So what happened to that disciplining force that competition used to exert on the conduct of firms? Well, we killed it off. Starting some 40 years ago, the Reaganomic views of Chicago School economists transformed antitrust. They threw out John Sherman's idea that we needed to keep companies competitive to prevent the emergence of autocrats of trade, and installed a new idea, that monopolies are evidence of efficiency. In other words, if Google has a 90% market share, which it does, then we should infer from that fact that Google is the best search engine ever, and moreover, the best search engine that is possible. After all, if that wasn't true, then some other company would have emerged to challenge Google's dominance. The fact that no better search engine has stepped in means that Google is so skilled, so efficient, that there's no conceivable way to improve on it. We can tell Google is the best because it has a monopoly, and we can tell that monopoly is benign because Google is the best. So 40 years ago, the US and its major trading partners instituted a pro-monopoly policy, and we got monopolies. Monopolies in pharma, in beer, in vitamin C, in glass bottles, in athletic shoes, in microchips, in cars, in mattresses, in eyeglasses, and of course, professional wrestling. Now remember, these are specific policies that were adopted in living memory by named individuals who were warned and got rich and never faced consequences. The economists who conceived of these pro-monopoly policies are still around today, polishing their fake-ass Nobel Prizes, teaching at elite schools, making millions consulting for blue-chip firms. And when we confront them with the wreckage that their policy created, they protest their innocence, maintaining with a straight face that there is no way to affirmatively connect pro-monopoly policies with the emergence of monopolies. It's like we used to put down rat poison and we didn't have a rat problem. And these guys made us stop, and now rats are eating our faces. And they're making these wide, innocent eyes, and they're saying, how can you be sure that our anti-rat poison policies are connected to the global conquest of the world by rats? Maybe this is simply the time of the rat. Maybe sunspots cause rats to adopt a new kind of fecundity never seen in history, so they multiplied and multiplied. And if they did go and buy all the rat poison factories and shut them down, well, so what of it? Shutting down a rat poison factory after you've decided not to put out rat poison anymore is an economically rational, Pareto optimal decision. Markets don't discipline tech companies because they don't compete with their rivals. They buy them. That's a quote, Mark Zuckerberg. It is better to buy than to compete. Quote, Mark Zuckerberg. Which is why Mark Zuckerberg bought Instagram for $1 billion. Even though Instagram only had 12 employees and 25 million users at the time. As he wrote in a spectacularly ill-advised middle-of-the-night email to the CFO, he had to buy Instagram because Facebook users were leaving Facebook for Instagram and not coming back. By buying Instagram, Zuckerberg ensured that anyone who left Facebook, the platform, remained captured by Facebook, the company. And despite the fact that Zuck put a confession in writing that his acquisition was intentionally anti-competitive, the Obama administration let that merger go ahead because every government of every political stripe for 40 years adopted this posture that monopolies are efficient. Now think about our twiddled, immiserated nurses. Hospitals are among the most consolidated sectors in the US, and the story of hospital consolidation is the story of pro-monopoly policy. First, we deregulated pharma mergers. And the pharma companies, they gobble each other up at the rate of knots, and then they jack up the price of drugs. So hospitals, they also merged to regional monopolies in a defensive maneuver that let a single hospital chain control the majority of a city or a region and say to the pharma companies, either you stop gouging us on drugs, or no one in town is going to get your products. Of course, once that mission was accomplished, the hospitals started to screw insurers. And then the insurers staged their own incestuous orgies, buying and merging, until most Americans had the option of 1, 2, maybe 3 insurers. And that let the insurers fight back against the hospitals and the farcical price of a hospital bed, but it left patients and healthcare workers defenseless against the consolidated power of hospitals, pharma companies, pharmacy benefit managers, group purchasing organizations, and other health industry cartels, duopolies, and monopolies. Which is why hospitals end up signing on to work for, or nurses end up signing on to work for hospitals using these ghastly apps. And remember, there's just 3 of these apps. They replaced dozens of staffing agencies that used to compete for the labor of nurses. Meanwhile, on the patient side, competition has never been a source of effective discipline in the healthcare sector. No one has ever shopped around for a cheaper ambulance or ER when they were having a heart attack. The price that people are willing to pay not to die is everything they have. So you have this sector that has no business being a commercial enterprise in the first place losing what little discipline was applied to it by competition, and that paves the way for unshadification. But as I said, there are four forces that discipline companies. The second one of these is regulation, the discipline that arises from a state. It's a mistake to see the discipline of markets and the discipline of states as completely disjoint realms that don't affect one another. They are intimately connected with one another, because competition is a necessary precondition for effective regulation. Let me put this in terms that even the most ideological libertarian can understand. Say you think that the only thing the government should do is one function, should be making sure that contracts are enforced. For the government to serve as referees in that game, it must have the power to compel the players to honor their contracts, which means that the smallest government you can have is determined by the largest corporation you're willing to permit. So even if you're the kind of musk-addled libertarian who can no longer open your copy of Atlas Shrugged because the pages are all stuck together, who pines for markets and human epitomes and demands the right to sell yourself into slavery, you should still want a robust antitrust regime so that contracts can be enforced. When a sector cartelizes, when it collapses into oligarchy, when the internet turns into 5 giant websites filled with screenshots and text from the other 4, that it captures its regulators. After all, a sector with 100 competing firms, that's a rabble. They're at each other's throats. They can't agree on anything. Importantly, they can't agree on what they're going to lobby on. While a sector of 5 companies or 4 or 3 or 2 or just one company, that's a cartel, it's a racket, it's a conspiracy in waiting. A sector that has been boiled down to a mere handful of firms can agree on a common lobbying position. And what's more, they're so insulated from wasteful competition that they are so aslosh in cash that they can mobilize this money to make their regulatory preferences into regulations. In other words, they capture their regulators. So regulatory capture, it's a big abstract term, but I'm going to make it very concrete for you right now. In the United Kingdom, they have a wonderful antitrust regulator called the Competition and Markets Authority. And until recently, it was run by a guy called Marcus Buckery. The Competition and Markets Authority has been one of the world's most effective investigators and regulators of big tech fuckery. Last month, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, fired Buckery and replaced him with a guy called Doug Gurr, whose last job was head of Amazon UK. Starmer, the chickens are the hens are on the line, they want their flocks back. So back to nurses. There are plenty of examples of regulatory capture lurking in this example of nurses and gig work. But I'm going to pick the most egregious one. The fact that our privacy regime is so terrible that a data broker will sell you information about the credit card debts of average Americans. The reason for this is that Congress has not passed a new consumer privacy law since 1988. That's when Ronald Reagan signed a law called the Video Privacy Protection Act that bans video store clerks from telling newspapers which VHS cassettes you have at home. The fact that Congress has not upgraded America's privacy protections since Die Hard was in theaters is not a coincidence, and it's not an oversight. It is expensively purchased inaction from a heavily concentrated and thus wildly profitable privacy invasion industry that has monetized the abuse of human rights at unimaginable scale. The coalition of keeping privacy law frozen in the era of the season finale of Say Elsewhere keeps growing because there is an unbounded set of ways to transform the systematic invasion of our human rights into cash. There is a direct line from this inaction to nurses whose paychecks go down when they can't pay their credit card bills. And that's because they don't have privacy protections. So competition is dead. Regulation is dead. Companies are neither disciplined by other firms, nor are they disciplined by states. But there are 4 forces that discipline firms, contributing to an inhospitable environment for the reproduction of sociopathic and shitifying monsters. So let's talk about those other 2 forces. The first one is interoperability, the principle of 2 things working together. Like you can put anyone's shoelaces in your shoes, you can put anyone's gas in your gas tank, and in your light socket. In the non-digital world, it's a lot of work to make interoperability work. To get that light bulb to work, you have to agree on the direction, the pitch, the diameter, the voltage, the amperage, the wattage of that light socket. Or someone's going to get their hand blown off changing the light bulb. But in the digital world, interop is something that comes built in. because there's only one kind of computer that we know how to make. The Turing-complete universal von Neumann machine, a computing machine capable of executing every valid program, which means that for any enshittifying program, there's a counter-enshittificatory program waiting to be written. If HP writes a program to ensure that its printers reject third-party ink, someone else can write a program to disable that checking. For GigWorks, anti-enshittificatory apps do yeoman duty. For example, in Indonesia, gig riders found co-ops that commission hackers to write modifications for the dispatch apps that they rely on for their living. For example, there's a taxi app that won't let you book a ride for someone who's just come in on a commuter train unless you're directly in front of the station. But when the big trains pull in, that spot is a dangerous nightmare to be close to. So the drivers have modded their apps so that they can spoof their GPS, which lets them park up around the corner while have the app tell their bosses that they're right in front of the station. And when the fare arrives, they zip over, pick up the fare, and zip out again without contributing to that station-side mishegoss. Here in the US, there's a company called Para that shipped an app to help DoorDash drivers get paid more. You see, DoorDash drivers get most of their money on tips, and the DoorDash driver app hides the tip amount until the dasher agrees to take the job. Meaning that as a dasher, you don't know if you're about to get a job that's worth $1.50 or $11.50 with a $10 tip until you've committed to taking it. So Para, they made an app that extracts the tip amount and shows it to the driver before they agree to take the job. And DoorDash shut it down, because here in America, an app like that is illegal, because in 1998, Bill Clinton signed the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act makes it a felony to bypass an effective means of access control to a copyrighted work, like an app, with penalties of $500,000 and a 5-year prison sentence for a first offense. So just the act of reverse engineering the app, like a DoorDash app, that's a potential felony, which is why companies are so desperately horny to get you to use their apps instead of their websites. The web is open and apps are closed. The majority of web users have installed an ad blocker, 51% of us. And those ad blockers are also privacy blockers. But no one's ever installed an ad blocker for their apps, because it's a felony to distribute that ad blocker, because you have to reverse engineer the apps to make it. An app is just another name for a website wrapped in the right kind of IP to make it a felony to protect your privacy while you use it. Around the world, we have enacted this thicket of IP laws that make it illegal to modify services, products, and devices to serve the interests of the people who use them rather than the interests of the companies that provide them. And like I said, these laws were enacted in living memory by people who were among us, who were warned about the obvious and eminently foreseeable consequences of their reckless plans, and who did it anyway. So I have to admit to something here. I'm a Canadian. We're everywhere. We're like serial killers. We look just like everybody else. Back in 2010, 2 Canadian ministers decided to copy-paste the American Digital Millennium Copyright Act onto Canada's statute books. They consulted on this proposal to make it illegal to reverse engineer devices that Canadians use, and they really got an earful. 6,138 Canadians wrote into this consultation to say that this was a terrible idea. They warned that making it illegal to bypass digital logs would interfere with the repair of devices as diverse as tractors, cars, and medical equipment from ventilators to insulin pumps. These Canadians, they warned that laws that ban tampering with digital logs would let American tech giants corner digital markets, forcing Canadians to buy their apps from American app stores so that they could cream off any commission that they chose to levy. They warned that these laws were a gift to monopolists who would jack up the price of ink, that these copyright laws would not serve Canadian artists, rather would lock them onto American platforms, because every time someone buys a Canadian artist's book or song or game or video, it would be locked into that American dominant app, and it could not be unlocked. So if you're a Canadian digital worker and you try to migrate to a Canadian store, your Canadian audience can come with you, because they couldn't move their purchases off that American app to a Canadian one. 6,138 Canadians filed comments saying this, and 54 respondents signed with the 2 ministers, Heritage Minister James Moore and Industry Minister Tony Clement. And James Moore gave a speech at the International Chamber of Commerce in Toronto, where he announced that they were throwing out the 6,138 comments from Canadians who opposed it, and they would only be listening to the 54 cranks who liked his ideas, because those 6,138 people who disagreed with him were babyish and radical extremists. So in 2012, Canada copied America's law onto its statute book, and now Canadians live in Tony Clement and James Moore's world, where it's illegal to tamper with the digital lock. So if a company puts a digital lock on its product, anything that it puts behind the digital lock is a crime to change. For example, when HP puts a digital lock on its printers that verifies that you're not using a third-party ink cartridge, or that you have refilled the HP cartridge you bought from them, it's a crime to bypass that lock so you can use third-party ink, which is how HP has gotten away with jacking the price of ink up and up and up, so that printer ink is today the most expensive fluid you can buy as a civilian without a special permit. It is colored water that costs $10,000 a gallon. You print your grocery list with fluid that costs more than the semen of a Kentucky Derby winning stallion. That's the world that Canadians got from Clement and Moore in living memory after they were born and did it anyway. The world where Canadian farmers can't fix their tractors and independent mechanics can't fix their cars, where hospitals during the pandemic lockdowns couldn't fix their own ventilators, where every time a Canadian iPhone user buys an app from a Canadian software author, every dollar they spend takes a round trip through Cupertino, California, and comes back 30 cents lighter. And let me remind you, this is also a world where a nurse cannot get a counter app or a plugin for the Uber for Nurses apps that they rely on, so that they can coordinate with other nurses, so that they would all refuse shifts unless the wage came up, or that would block surveillance of their activities that allows the apps to tighter their wages down. So interoperability, it was once a major disciplining force on companies, on tech firms. After all, if you make the ads on your website sufficiently obnoxious, some fraction of your users are going to go out and install an ad blocker. And once they do that, you are never going to earn another penny for them, because while a user might install an ad blocker, they're never going to uninstall that ad blocker. But once it's illegal to make an ad blocker, there's no reason not to make the ads as disgusting, invasive, and obnoxious as you can to shift all the value from your users back to your own shareholders. So we've got monopolies, and monopolies capture their regulators, and they get to ignore the laws that they don't like, and prevent laws that might interfere with predatory conduct from being passed, like new privacy laws. And they get new laws passed, IP laws, that let them wield government power to prevent other companies from entering the market. And thus we see three of the forces being neutralized: competition, regulation, and interoperability, which leaves one disciplining force still holding the line, and that is labor. Now, the tech workforce is a very strange kind of workforce, because they've historically been very powerful, while at the same time not being in unions. Union density in the tech sector is so low that it's almost undetectable. But tech workers' power didn't come from solidarity, it came from scarcity, from demand. There just weren't enough tech workers to fill all the jobs that were going begging, and tech workers are unfathomably productive. Even with the sky-high salaries that they were able to extract, every hour of labor the tech worker put in at the shop generated far more income for their bosses. Faced with this tight labor market and the ability to turn every hour of tech worker overtime into gold, tech bosses pulled out all the stops to motivate their workers. They appealed to those workers' sense of mission. They convinced them they were holy warriors, ushering in a new digital age. Google promised them that they would, quote, organize the world's information and make it useful. Facebook promised them that they would make the world more open and connected. There's a name for this tactic. The librarian Fobazi Ettar, she calls it vocational awe. Vocational awe is an appeal to a sense of mission and pride that's used to motivate workers to put in longer hours for worse pay. There are all kinds of professions that run on vocational awe. Of course, there's teaching, daycares, elder care, nursing. Now, techies are different from those other professions because they've historically been incredibly scarce, which meant that while their bosses could motivate them to work on projects that they believed in for endless hours, the very minute their bosses ordered them to shitify the projects that they had missed their mother's funeral to deliver on time, those workers could tell their bosses to fuck off. And if their bosses persisted in those demands, the techies could walk off the job, cross the street, and get a better job at the shop across the street. So for many years, tech workers, they were the fourth and final constraint, holding the line after the constraints of competition, regulation, and interoperability melted away. But then came the mass tech layoffs. 260,000 workers were turned out of the tech sector in 2023. Another 150,000 were fired in 2024. Tens of thousands have been fired this year alone. Facebook has just announced a 5% across the board tech worker headcount at the same time as they announced that they were doubling their executive bonuses. Tech workers do not tell their bosses to go fuck themselves anymore because there's 10 other workers waiting to take their jobs. Now, I promised I wasn't going to talk about AI tonight, but I am going to talk about it just a little to point out that I think the reason that tech bosses are so horny for AI is because they think it's going to let them fire their tech workers and replace them with client chatbots that will never tell them to fuck them. So that's where shitification comes from. These multiple changes to the environment, the fourfold collapse of competition, regulation, interoperability, and worker power. And that creates an enshitogenic environment where the greediest, most sociopathic elements in the body corporate thrive at the expense of those elements that serve as down-regulators and checks on enshitificatory impulses. Now, we can try and cure these corporations. We can use antitrust law to break them up. We can fine them. We can force strictures upon them. But until we fix that environment, the contagion will spread to other firms. So let's talk about how we create a hostile environment for enshitifiers. So the population and importance of those enshittifying agents in those companies dwindles to those 1990 levels. We're not going to get rid of them so long as the profit motive is intact. There will always be people whose pursuit of profit is pathological, unmoderated by shame or decency. But we have had environments in which those elements of firms did not dominate our lives. So let's start with antitrust. After 40 years of antitrust decline, this decade has seen a global massive resurgence of antitrust vigor. And it's come in both left and right-wing flavors. Over the past 4 years, the Biden administration's trustbusters at the Federal Trade Commission, the DOJ, and the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau did more antitrust work in 4 years than all their predecessors had done in the previous 40. Now, there's certainly factions of the Trump administration who are very hostile to that agenda. But Trump's antitrust enforcers at the DOJ and FTC now say that they will preserve and enforce the new merger guidelines passed under Biden that stop companies from buying each other up. And that FTC has already filed suit to block one giant tech merger. And of course, last summer, a judge found that Google was guilty of monopolization. And now Google is facing a breakup, which is one reason that Google has sucked up so hard to the Trump administration. Meanwhile, in Canada, that toothless competition bureau just got fitted for a set of titanium dentures. They got a new law that gives them broad and sweeping enforcement powers. And it's true, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer did just fire the head of the Competition and Markets Authority and replace him with the guy who used to run Amazon UK. But the thing that makes that tragic and important is that the UK Competition and Markets Authority has been doing astonishingly great work under a succession of conservative governments in the UK. And in the EU, they passed the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, and they're going after big tech with both barrels. Other countries around the world, Australia, Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, and China, yes, China, have passed new antitrust laws, launched major antitrust enforcement actions, and they collaborate with each other. So in the UK, the Competition and Markets Authority used its investigatory powers to publish a deep market study on Apple's 30% app tax. And the EU used that report to craft both an enforcement action and a regulation that curbed Apple's use of its monopoly payment processor. And then South Korea and Japan translated the European case into their own language and brought identical cases and won them in their courts too. So what about regulatory capture? Well, we are starting to see regulators getting smarter about reining in big tech. For example, the EU's Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act are designed to bypass the national courts in Europe, especially the Irish courts. Ireland is a tax haven where US tech companies pretend that their European headquarters are based. And the thing about a tax haven is that it always turns into a crime haven. Because if Apple can pretend to be Irish this week, the next week it can pretend that it was Maltese or Cypriot or Luxembourgeois. So Ireland has to let US big tech companies ignore European privacy laws and all their other regulations, or they're going to lose them to sleazier, more biddable competitor nations. So from now on, The European Union has said that all of their enforcement actions against big tech are going to happen in the European Union's federal courts, not in those national courts. They're treating Ireland as damage and writing around it. Now, last year, Canada, we passed two very exciting bills, a national right to repair bill and a national interoperability law. And nominally, these laws allow Canadians to fix everything from tractors to insulin pumps and to modify the software in their devices, from games consoles to printers, so they work with third-party apps, consumables, and add-ons. But those bills are essentially useless because those bills don't permit Canadians to acquire the tools to break digital laws. So you can modify your printer to accept third-party ink, or you can modify your car so that a third-party mechanic can diagnose it, but only if you don't have to go through around digital log to do so, because giving someone a tool to go around a digital log remains illegal under that 2012 law that Tony Clement and James Moore passed. And of course, every single printer, every smart speaker, every car, every tractor, every appliance, every medical implant, every piece of big hospital tech has a digital log that stops you from fixing it, modifying it, or using third-party parts, software, or consumables in it. Which means that these landmark laws on interoperable repair, they're dead letters, they're useless. So why don't we get rid of that 2012 law that bans breaking digital logs? Well, here's where it gets interesting. Those laws are part of Canada's trade agreements with the United States. If we didn't pass those laws, we wouldn't have had tariff-free access to American markets. Now, I don't know if you've heard, Donald Trump is announcing 25% across the board tariff on Canadian imports. Prime Minister Trudeau's response was to impose retaliatory tariffs, which makes every product from America that a Canadian buys 25% more expensive, which is a very weird way to punish America. Do you know what would have been better? If Canada had abolished the law that protects US big tech companies from Canadian competitors, made it legal to reverse engineer, jailbreak, and modify American technologies and services, made it legal for Canadian mechanics to jailbreak your Tesla and unlock every subscription feature, from autopilot to full access to your battery for one price forever. And when you sell it, the next owner gets it too, meaning your car is not worth more. That's how you hurt Elon Musk. Not by being performatively appalled at his Nazi salutes. The fact that you're angry at him doesn't cost him a dime. He loves the attention. But if you strike at the rent-extracting, insanely high margin aftermarket subscriptions that he relies on to keep his swastika business afloat, you will kick that guy right in the tongue. Let Canadians stand up a Canadian App Store for Apple devices to charge 3% to process transactions, not 30%. So every Canadian news outlet that sells subscription through an app, and every Canadian software author, musician, and writer who sells through a mobile platform gets a 25% increase in revenue overnight without signing up a single new customer or selling a single new object. But of course, they will sign up new customers. Selling jailbreaking software and access to Canadian app stores for every mobile device and games console to everyone in the world by pitching every games publisher and app maker on selling in the Canadian stores to customers everywhere without paying that 30% big to the American big tech mobiles duopoly. They could sell every mechanic in the world a $100 a month subscription to a universal diagnostic tool for every car, and every farmer in the world could buy a kit to jailbreak their John Deere tractors without paying the $200 call-out charge for the Deere technician who expects the repair that the farmer themselves is expected to make. They would beat a path to Canada's door. Canada could become a tech export powerhouse while making everything cheaper for Canadian tech users, while making everything more profitable for anyone who sells media or software in an online store. And this is the best part, it's a frontal assault on the largest, most profitable American companies that have single-handedly kept the S&P 500 in the black for the last decade, striking directly at their most profitable lines of business, taking revenues from those rip-off scams from hundreds of billions to zero overnight everywhere in the world. Canada does not have to stop at exporting reasonably priced pharmaceuticals to Americans. They could export incredibly lucrative tools of technological liberation. That's how you win a trade war. And it's not just Canada. Mexico, Colombia, the Global South, the European Union, countries all around the world have adopted these laws because the US Trade Representative told them they needed to have it, and then in exchange they get unlimited access to American markets. Trump is getting rid of that stuff. You know, Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan's court sorcerer, when they asked him how he was going to get his ideas to be realized when they were so unpopular and they ran so counter to the post-war consensus. He said, in times of crisis, ideas move from the periphery to the center in an instant. And when the oil crisis struck, he transformed our world for the worse. We're living in his world now because his theory of change was completely correct. We are living through another oil crisis, and it's a chance we can take. So what about workers? Well, there's good news and bad news about workers. The good news is very good. Public approval for unions is at a high water mark not last seen since the 1970s. More workers want to join a union than at any time in living memory, and unions themselves have record-breaking cash reserves that they can use to organize those workers. Now here's the bad news. Unions spent the Biden years when they had the most favorable regulatory environment since the Carter administration, when public support for unions was at an all-time high, when more workers than ever wanted to join a union, when they had more money than ever to spend organizing workers, doing fuck all. They allocated mere pittances to union organizing efforts. We finished the Biden years with fewer unionized workers than we started them with. And then we got Trump, who illegally fired the National Labor Relations Board member, Gwen Wilcox, and that left the NLRB without a quorum, and so they can't act on unfair labor practices, they can't certify union elections, and of course this is terrible, but it is not game over. Trump thinks that when you fire the referees, that means the game is over. But here's the thing, firing referees doesn't end the game. It means that we don't have rules anymore. Trump thinks that labor law created unions, but it's backwards. Unions are how we got labor law. Long before unions were legal, we had unions who were fighting pitched battles in the streets against goons, gangs, and company thugs. And that illegal solidarity resulted in the passage of labor law that legalized unions. Labor law was passed because workers built power through solidarity. Law does not create solidarity, it just gives it the formal basis. Strip away the formal basis, and the worker power remains. Worker power is what we need to do with our vocational law, because it is good for you and your fellow workers to feel a sense of mission and accomplishment in the jobs you do every day. And if you do feel that sense of mission, if you feel a duty to protect your users, your students, your patients, your patrons, a union lets you fulfill that duty. The unscheduled mid-air disassembly of American labor law means that workers can have each other's backs again, and tech workers need other workers' help. Because tech workers are not scarce anymore, not after the 500,000 layoffs, which means tech bosses aren't afraid of them anymore. We know what tech bosses do to workers they're not afraid of. Look at Jeff Bezos. The workers in his warehouse are injured on the job at 3 times the rate of workers in competing warehouses. His delivery drivers have to pee in bottles, and they are monitored at all times by AI cameras that snitch on them if their eyeballs aren't correctly configured, or if their mouth is open too often when they drive because it's against the law to sit on the job. By contrast, Amazon's coders get to show up to work with pink mohawks, facial piercings, and black t-shirts that say things their bosses don't understand. And whenever they want to pee, they just go to the bathroom. Jeff Bezos is not sentimental about tech workers, nor does he harbor a particularized hatred of warehouse workers and delivery drivers. He treats the workers however he can get away with. And that means pee bottles are coming for Amazon's coders. It's not just Amazon. Think about Apple. Tim Cook, Apple's headley CEO, was elevated to his job in 2011. And he was chosen by Apple's board to succeed founder Steve Jobs because he is the guy who figured out how to move Apple's production to contract manufacturing in China, without skimping on quality assurance or suffering leaks of product specifications ahead of the company's legendary showy launches. Today, Apple's products are made in a gigantic Foxconn factory in Zhengzhou. It's nicknamed iPhone City. And indeed, the devices made in iPhone City arrive at the port of Los Angeles in a state of pristine perfection, manufactured to the finest tolerances with nary a PR. And to achieve this miraculous feat of supply chain management, all Tim Cook had to do was make iPhone City into a living hell. A place that's so horrific to work at that they had to install suicide nets around the workers' dorms to catch the plummeting bodies of workers who were so brutalized by Tim Cook's sweatshop that they tried to take their own lives. Tim Cook is not sentimentally attached to tech workers, nor is he hostile to Chinese assembly line workers. He just treats his workers as badly as he can get away with. And with mass layoffs in the tech sector, his coders can be treated much, much worse. How do tech workers get unions? Well, there are tech worker-specific organizations like Tech Solidarity and the Tech Workers Coalition. But tech workers will only get unions by having solidarity with other workers and getting solidarity back from them. We all need to support every union, and all workers need to have each other's backs. We are entering the period of omni-shambolic polycrisis. The ominous rumble of climate change, authoritarianism, genocide, xenophobia, and transphobia turned into an avalanche. The perpetrators of these crimes against humanity have weaponized the internet. They've colonized the 21st century's digital nervous system, and they're using it to attack its host to threaten civilization itself. The internet was purpose-built for this kind of apocalyptic co-option, organized around giant companies that would trade a habitable planet and human rights for all of us for a 3% tax cut for themselves, who default us all into twiddle-friendly algorithmic feeds and block interoperability that would let us escape their clutches with the backing of powerful governments whom they can call upon to protect their IP rights. It didn't have to be this way. The internet was not inevitable. It was the product of specific policy choices. Choices that we have an unusual moment to unmake right now as everything is changing in this moment of chaos and terror. I don't believe in optimism. I'm a science fiction writer, which means that I think that prediction is a mug's game. Optimism is the idea that no matter what you do, things are going to get better. And it's no different from pessimism and the idea that no matter what you do, things will get worse. Both of them are forms of fatalism. I think that what's more useful than optimism or pessimism is hope. The idea that if you materially improve your circumstances in some way, if you make one move to ascend the gradient towards a better world, that from your new vantage point, you will discover terrain that you couldn't see from where you were at before, new paths that you can take. That's the difference between a novel and real life. When I read a novel, I can plot a path from A to Z. In the real world, we're always going up and down, taking our losses, licking our wounds, and finding a new way to move on. It's a really frightening moment right now, but we have incredible opportunities in front of us, opportunities that we have not seen in generations to change how everyone in the world interacts with their technology, and to have that technology blow back into America in ways that strike at the power of the corporations that have destroyed the American body politic and that have merged with the state to control and surveil us and to threaten all of our well-being. So that is my improvised ending to my speech, because you might have seen I turned the last page over and realized I was missing the last page.